What's up, everyone? It's Dakota, and welcome back to another Pioneer video. And yes, we are finally getting to the Pioneer format, going over some of our winners and losers of the format like we did with Modern. This time it's going to be a little bit more coherent. I kind of went back and forth between some winners and losers in the Modern video, and I think I'm just going to kind of stick to, going into a nice little pattern here. Like, we'll go over the winners first, talk about the losers. We'll obviously have some reasonings as to why I am making those assumptions / statements. And then we'll have some predictions of the format at the end, kind of what to expect going forward. And at least in the short term, potentially long-term effects up until the next banned and restricted announcement, which is going to take place about like the middle of December. I think December 16th was what was written in the article. Of course, we'll go back over what cards actually got banned, and then that'll kind of set the tone for the video. Of course, before we get too deep into any of that stuff, if you're not already subscribed to the channel and you want to see more videos from me, where we talk a lot about the Modern and Pioneer format, as well as some other longer form content, if any of that interests you, please consider subscribing and ringing that notification bell so you know when those videos get posted. And it's a free, easy way to support me and my content. We are so close to 1,000 subscribers, y'all. Like, I thought like a week ago, I'm like, maybe, by like October or whatever. I think it's going to be a real possibility that we actually get there before the regional championship. And that's kind of been like a new goal of mine as we, again, march closer to that regional championship, just over a month away. Look forward to it. There's going to be a lot of Pioneer stuff because we're going to be testing some different things for that format in preparation for that event. So, stick around, all that fun stuff. With that out of the way, let's go ahead. Let's kind of go back over the banned and restricted announcement that we got for Pioneer, and then we will get into our winners and losers. So here, conveniently, with my master editing skills, I have thrown up a screenshot of the Pioneer banned and restricted announcement, which shows Amalia, Benavides, Aguirre getting banned, and Sorin Imperious Bloodlord. Kind of the TLDR on all of those are, the fact that they are the top decks in the format. They don't think that Amalia is essentially a very well-designed card, kind of like with the oversight and everything on it. I think if it was like 20 or more power, they might have, it might have been spared the hammer, but with the way that it was built and everything, they just want to make sure they axe any potential draws that could happen. And of course, Sword and Imperious Bloodlord being a one-sided show and tell for vampires, and there's been a very good vampire in particular in Vein Ripper. So instead of banning the big thing that was kind of the problem, or at least one half of the problem, they just got rid of the other half of the problem, and will essentially open up some design space for some vampires that won't have their costs kind of cheated. So however you feel about those sort of things, we've kind of gone over those feelings here on this channel on our Monday video, and then we're going to be going over on the podcast episode, which should go up on Saturday morning. So what's the first winner of the format? Well, notice how I said the top two decks of the format, because there is a third deck where maybe here recently it hasn't been super relevant because it seems like that Rakdos Vampires has kind of jumped up in play. Then Rakdos Midrange adopted like the Sorin Vein Ripper package, and then just kind of played its normal Rakdos mid-range self. And of course, Amalia just being, the deck that everybody played because it's just it's a really good combo deck that can just win the game on turn 3 versus Sorin Vein Ripper not technically winning the game on turn 3. So that third deck that people kind of forgot about that I think is very beloved in the format is It Phoenix? It turns out, at least in their explanation during the Twitch stream, I believe on Tuesday or Wednesday, they talked about Treasure Cruise and how that even though it's kind of banned in the Modern format, it's banned in Legacy. It's a very good card. It's essentially a Ancestral Recall that, of course, you have to delve 7 cards out of your graveyard to be able to play it. It's still a 1-mana draw 3 for a lot of decks, and for this one in particular, Is It Phoenix has a very easy time of filling its graveyard, while also getting to use some graveyard synergies with the card Arclight Phoenix, to where, it just dumps enough cards in its graveyard to where it's not going to have to exile the Phoenixes, and then it's going to be able to gas back up to potentially set up other turns where it can get those creatures back, as well as, with some builds playing Prophecytic Memory, a 1-mana draw 3 when you have, a board full of like Ledger Shredders and you just play a bunch of cantrips with like Consider and Opt. The deck is a well-oiled machine. I would expect that this is going to be the best graveyard deck going forward. The fact that it is, we're essentially going to go back to in like the early stages of this format right now, to kind of defaulting to some of the other better decks and maybe some of the decks that really weren't viable, which will kind of also be featured in our winners section. I will shout out Greasefang because, of course, I recorded a Why Nobody Plays video on that deck. I guess that card and that deck in general, and now it's infinitely better now that Amalia and the Rakdos Vampires deck is now gone. But I would expect going forward that the already best graveyard deck when these two decks were around, and one of the best graveyard decks in the early parts, or I guess of the initial deck list dump of the Pro Tour Merge of Carlisle Manor, where we had these two decks kind of show up, Amalia and Rakdos Vampires, respectively, kind of have their breakout Pro Tour moments. I would just expect that Izzet Phoenix kind of takes that top spot early on, and in some of the early metagame shares that we see, Izzet Phoenix is up there in percentage and has shot up comparatively to where it's been. It's always been double-digit play, and it is going to continue to see that. So I would advise being prepared to play against this deck quite a lot while players try to figure out what else they want to do in the format. There's going to be a lot of kind of exploring to see what's going to end up being good. But I also think that all reliable Izzet Phoenix is going to be the deck that people kind of default to try to maybe win some of the events. I think it's going to have some of the most innovation because there is going to be a lot of players playing this deck, and in turn it's going to have the target put on its head yet again. But it seems like they're going to be pretty shy on banning something like Treasure Cruise. So there's a potential that going into next year, or that Pioneer RCQ season, we could see Izzet Phoenix with one of the best tools in the format, still legal in the deck. Of course, Fable the Mirrorbreaker as well, getting an honorable mention, just like Greasefang, as being a card that's on the watch list. And seems like it's the more likely card to get banned than Treasure Cruise, which is crazy to say for a 1-mana draw 3 spell. With a Ganache to put on that. But yeah, Izzet Phoenix is one of my winners, and probably one of the biggest winners because it was playing like third fiddle. It was like the chick of the like Cars universe where you're good and everything, but you got the king and you got Lightning McQueen there. So now Izzet Phoenix gets to shoot up to the front and hopefully win its Piston Cup. So that's Izzet Phoenix. That's one of my biggest winners of the format early on here from the bannings. Let's go ahead and take a look at one of our other winners. Our next winner of the format on our list here is Boros Convoke. It could be said that Amalia was a pretty bad matchup for this deck, and it definitely showed, at least in my personal experience, it never felt close. Like pretty crazy. Even like my opponent knowing what I'm going to do and everything just didn't matter. Like they held back, sure. Like you're just going to die to the Aetherflux Reservoir that's on top of my library. So, I mean, really, you needed some super explosive draws, and the Amalia deck definitely needed to stumble, but there's also a lot of times it just stumbled into wins as well. So, even that wasn't like a foolproof plan. But you were like never winning against it as Boros Convoke, and of course with how big of a metagame share it had. Plus, like Rakdos midrange, definitely had a lot of removal in the deck. Plus, just having a really big creature that was going to kind of help it, beat a lot of its big creatures or just some of its creatures in combat, and also gain you some life, was pretty bad for Boros Convoke. It was especially worse if they, were able to do their Vein Ripper thing on turn 3 and then play removal spells like afterwards. Pretty bad for Boros Convoke. That said, those two decks don't exist anymore. Of course, we kind of expect, and a little bit of a spoiler, like Rakdos midrange will still stick around because it was a already well played deck before Merge with Carlisle Manor, and it was one of the top 3 most played decks then. And now it's kind of coming to its own. Boros Convoke really didn't have that like distinction, but it was a deck that I think players underestimated quite a bit going into that Pro Tour, just because, again, a deck that puts like 14 power into play in turn 2, plus if you don't put 14 power into play, you end up just playing like a Night Air and a VO, so you still have 9 power in play, going and potentially getting an Imidane's Recruiter, which is going to put even more power on the board, on top of it just being its own like 3 power haste threat. So, it allowed the deck to go pretty wide and then pretty tall as well, getting to add, again, a ton of power to the board and potentially kill your opponent and immediately put the pressure on them, because now targeted removal isn't really going to work all that well. You can get rid of the biggest thing, but they still have a board full of 1/1s and a 2/2 that presumably you have not added to the board already, and more than likely you're just going to end up being trading resources rather than potentially eating some of their creatures, if you will. So a lot of things I like about this deck. Night Air Nevios and Venerated Loxodon are huge. Of course, as I kind of pointed out, Night Air Nevios is going to kind of recoup some of the cards that you spent, adding to the board, and then potentially having the closeout ability of like Imidane Recruiter, plus playing potentially another 1-drop. Again, just adding more power to the board that Imidane Recruiter is going to also continue to add to the board. Venerated Loxodon, just making all of those creatures bigger. And their 4/4 bodies are really nice because a lot of the creatures that could check these creatures that I would expect to be to see play in the format isn't going to block and beat them in combat until like turn 4, which is totally fine when this deck is putting all this power into play on turn 2, as we just talked about. And just overall, I really like how this deck is positioned. I think two pretty bad, one really bad matchup, and one matchup I could see being pretty bad for it. Definitely at times, if you don't have kind of like these busted draws, are now out of the format, and it's going to be interesting to see if the players come back to this deck, or we see something like Slick Shot Aggro seeing a lot of play. I think a lot of people are going to go back to like this Boros Convoke strategy, and I think kind of like the differences between Boros Convoke and like Slick Shot Aggro is going to be more like, do you want to go wide and be a little bit worse, I would say, against the like the Supreme Verdicts of the world. Like if you expect like Blue-White Control to be pretty popular, Blue-White Control having access to Supreme Verdict is going to be pretty rough, or any other like 4-mana Wrath that the deck could have access to. If you either don't have a fast draw where, it's Slick Shot Aggro, you kind of go wide, but you end up kind of killing all in one turn. So it's definitely interesting to see how things go. I think one deck is going to be worse against like the decks that have targeted removal, and the other one's going to be worse against, board wipes and things like that. So it's going to be interesting to see what players gravitate towards to, and I guess like what the player base at large is kind of comfortable with losing to. But that is one of my winners of the format, Boros Convoke, a deck that was essentially relegated to irrelevancy and has now kind of been thrusted in the spotlight. It won one of the challenges, I believe the earliest challenge after the Pioneer bannings and things like that. So definitely a deck that is definitely going to see a lot more play than it did before. So let's go ahead and move on to our next winner. So I'm going to keep these two short and sweet. We have Rakdos Midrange being another winner. Now Rakdos Midrange doesn't have to play Sorin Vein Ripper package, which of course we know is like one of the best things to be doing in the format, because obviously it worked out for vampires, greatly, and then for Rakdos Midrange as just an archetype, ended up seeing a lot of play because of also playing this Vein Ripper package. I just believe that it's going to be a deck that has already been pretty good. It's proven to be really good. There's a lot of the good threats that I expect to kind of show up against the metagame at large. Of course, we talked about Is It Phoenix being a really good deck. I think cards like Graveyard Trespasser and Shielded are going to be very good in those matchups. Bone Crusher Giant is just a huge threat that can come down pretty early, as well as like Fable the Mirror Breaker still being a very powerful Magic card that a lot of decks just have a hard time kind of handling without spending multiple resources to do so. So I would expect Rakdos Midrange is going to be Rakdos Midrange-ing and just getting to do its thing. It's going to be tuning the numbers. We might see it go back to like the Inti plus Smuggler's Copter kind of thing going on, but overall I would expect this deck to kind of be thrusted as the main Rakdos deck, because now it's just there by default. Lastly, it's a deck that I absolutely despise playing, because it's probably the most embarrassed I have ever felt like playing a deck like on live, like so much so it's like one of the few videos I think I've actually like hidden on my channel. I'm going to out myself by saying that, but it's Lotus Field. And I played this deck a lot when Underworld Breach was legal, and it was definitely playing a whole different game than what anyone else was doing in the format at the time. And I played it again recently, and I think I just don't personally enjoy it. I think for a lot of reasons why other people don't like combo decks, where it's like, man, I play against it, my opponent just has the nuts both games, and I just get absolutely crushed. But then like when I play it, and my opponent gives me like infinite turns to kind of like come up with like a turn to like combo, and I just don't seem like I can combo. Maybe that's what the kids say is a skill issue, but definitely with a lot of these matchups, these really bad decks now being kind of pushed out of the format, I would expect Lotus Field to kind of take the spotlight and kind of be the premier combo deck of the format. This deck gets just definitely gets better with the bannings, and I really hope that I'm wrong, because again, I hate playing against this deck. I hate playing it, and this is coming from a person that played it for quite a long time. Maybe I'm just not smart enough for it anymore. Definitely have lost some brain cells just like slamming aggro decks into a wall. But, overall, I think Lotus Field is, one of our last winners of the format. Now, that doesn't mean that other decks don't get better. I referenced the Abzan Greasefang deck has also been seeing quite a bit of play, is instantly, allowing me to insert my foot in my mouth from saying that the deck was just kind of bad. And of course, it only took the, best Abzan deck in the format and at least the top 2 decks of the format to make it a playable deck again. But, it's something I would expect to also see getting better. I think a lot of the aggro decks in general also end up getting better as well now that Amalia is gone and they don't have that instant, yeet your aggro opponent into the sun, with Chord of Calling. So that's a big generalization of my winners of the format. I think these decks get obviously very better with the bannings. Some of them just end up taking the top spot. Other ones I think are just going to be, pretty early on, people are going to gravitate towards playing these decks just because at one point or another they were one of the best decks to play in the format, or they do something that is inherently broken that the format definitely struggles to kind of handle. So I think that these are going to be some interesting picks to go forward. If you're interested in picking up any of these decks, I will link the deck list in the description down below, just from some of their more recent plannings, whether they 5-0'd a league or did very well in a challenge. So that's my winners of the format. Let's go ahead and take a look at some of our losers of the format. So the first loser, and arguably the biggest one, is vampires as an archetype total. They weren't really a thing before the Pro Tour, and then at the Pro Tour they were, pretty dominant, ended up actually winning the event, and then, of course, being, a dominating force for the next, 6 to 7 months of the Pioneer format. But with Sorin getting banned instead of Vein Ripper, it definitely gets rough for that archetype as a whole. I think the Vamps package in Rakdos was almost guaranteed to get worse, whether it was Sorin or Vein Ripper to get banned, because Sorin really wasn't seeing a lot of play without Vein Ripper, and then, Vein Ripper probably doesn't see very much play, if any, without Sorin. I think Vein Ripper is still a very good creature, but paying 6 mana for 6/5, is definitely a lot worse than, paying 3 mana for 6/5. That's pretty hard to get off the board when you've already, Fatal Pushed and Thoughtseized your way to clear the way for Sorin, but then also make sure your opponent has to, play a creature, play a removal spell, and then sack that creature they just played, and, maybe they got value for it. Who knows? But this does kind of inhibit some fancy word for making vampires a lot worse by kind of reducing the explosiveness of the deck, where even if it was a Vein Ripper banning, maybe vampires gets explored a little bit more as an archetype, where we kind of see it turn into more aggressive strategy. We've seen historically vampires be, white-black, and then, of course, being black-red, just because that was the best combination or best color combination to play in the format. But at least with Sorin available to them in the format, if there's another really good vampire, they could just play it and it'd be kind of sweet. But I think this is ends up being priced safer for the fact of, as their reasoning, it's easier to ban the card that cheats the cost than a card that is that doesn't have an inherent cheating cost to it. So unfortunately, I think this means that vampires won't see any meaningful play in Pioneer. Of course, Blood Tithe Harvester is still a very good card, so we could see Blood Tithe Harvester seeing play. But I think seeing kind of these more typal strategies in the format, we're not really going to see those anymore, just because I think Sorin not being able to pair with Vein Ripper, or Vein Ripper not being able to pair with Sorin is pretty rough, and we're going to be waiting to see maybe some more vampires that could be cheap lords that end up getting you some extra benefit to playing them as well, that are going to be really aggressively costed for their cost. But unless we see something like that, vampires is as quickly as it showed up, is now gone from the format, but definitely has the distinction of having one of the best runs, I would say, of a Pioneer deck ever, considering it got up to 30% of the metagame, over 30% of the metagame, according to MTG Goldfish, and was a deck that you absolutely needed to prepare for in almost any case. I didn't care how broke people are, or whatever the case may be, you were almost guaranteed to see vampires. Even if you went to your kid's recital, there was probably some grown adult there that was playing vampires or whatever. That's just how ubiquitous I think this deck was. So glad to see it gone. Another kind of loser of the format is another very obvious one, the Amalia lovers. That includes me, because I absolutely love playing the deck. I love creature combo decks, the slightest bit of background about me. Absolutely love playing Yawgmoth in the modern format. Only really recently got off of it and started kind of exploring and playing some other decks. But I absolutely love playing Yawgmoth. I love creature decks. Amalia, to me, just felt like another way for me to get to jam Quarter Calling into my deck and then build some of these like more complicated board states with Amalia, with like this instant win button that was kind of available to me. So it was a lot of fun. Didn't get to hang around for a long time, but it was a lot of fun playing this. Like I said earlier, I think Amalia is definitely a more interesting build around than Wildgrowth Walker, but clearly, maybe there'll be some pretty good Explore cards, and we'll see kind of like this Explore package being introduced into mid-range decks, maybe after we see Fable the Mirrorbreaker potentially go. But I think until that happens, Wildgrowth Walker is going to see next to no play. There's probably going to be people that are trying to play it, but I don't think any reason to play Wildgrowth Walker. And I think those are some of my biggest losers. I think a lot of decks just get better. I think the format as a whole just gets a lot better with Rakdos Vampires being around. I guess, you can include the losers of this format being me, because, again, I made a video about Abzan Greasefang being, basically unplayable or no reason to play it. And now with the bannings, it has been thrust back into viability. So the egg's on my face, but nonetheless, those are my losers of the format. Overall, I think Pioneer ends up being in a pretty good place. So with that said, let's go ahead and talk some predictions of the format and try to wrap up this video. So what are my predictions for the Pioneer format? And I don't think they're going to be super shocking to anybody, just because they might be the lukewarmest of takes. But I think going forward, I think the Izzet Phoenix deck is going to be the best deck in the format. I think in the early parts of the format, it's going to be very, very good. And I think as people try to figure out what they want to do, I think that this deck is still going to be a threat to the format. So for a few reasons, I think it interacts very efficiently with just about any deck. I know, crazy statement. It has a bunch of 1-mana removal, like Lightning Axe and Fiery Impulse, that are very good at dealing with a lot of the creatures in the format. With Axe also having, another layer where you can just fuel cards, put these cards in your graveyard, where you're going to be able to fuel Treasure Cruises a little bit quicker. You're going to be able to put Phoenixes in your graveyard so that you can get them back on the same turn that you end up casting Lightning Axe, which is going to be really, really good. And with some of the decks that I expect to be a lot better in the format, like Boros Convoke and Greasefang, the 1 mana deal 3 damage, 1 mana deal 5 damage, discard a card, is going to help put pressure on those decks to, try to get to the board, early and try to sneak underneath some of these removal spells, and it's going to put an emphasis on them being on the play, which I think is going to be very hard for them to beat Phoenix on the draw. And there's even going to be some cases where Phoenix gets to be on the draw and still ends up performing very, very well. Spell Pierce is always a beating, no matter what era of Magic you played in. Spell Pierce sucks because it always hits you at the worst possible moment and ends up being a great tempo play, and I would expect Spell Pierce to still see some number of copies being played in the main deck of these Phoenix decks. And then, of course, as many cantrips as you want, plus they get to play Ancestral Recall in their deck, and it's going to allow you to dig through so many cards. You're going to be able to look through, half to 2/3 of your deck almost every game. It's going to be very hard to not find all the things or most of the things that you would need to try and close out the game, or even just stop your opponent from getting to do their thing. I think that the Phoenix deck in game ones are going to be very tough to deal with for the fact of the resiliency of the card Arclight Phoenix, and just how big Ledger Shredders and stuff can get. Of course, there's just a lot of room to innovate in the deck as well. I believe that also the fact that this was the most played deck at Pro Tour Murders of Karlov Manor, the two decks that ended up being the most played afterwards in Amalia and Vampires, of course, is now gone, as we had stated at the beginning of this video. Phoenix has always kind of had a target on its back. People are kind of annoyed with this deck, rightfully so, because just the fact of how annoying it is to kind of deal with their board of Phoenixes just for them on the next turn to bring them back and then somehow get another one as well. It's kind of like Squadron, it's like a red Squadron Hawk almost. But, with that said, kind of the format pedigree that it has, the fact that it was one of the most played decks at its respective Pro Tour, at Pro Tour Murders of Karlov Manor. Its other top two decks in the format are out. I think it's going to be very easy to gravitate towards this deck because I think it has a very kind of rewarding feeling, kind of like game plan, where you're casting all these cantrips, you're doing a lot of things on your turn, and then potentially interacting with your opponent on their turn as well, and it just feels so impactful. And again, to reiterate, this deck gets to play Ancestral Recall. How do you not want to play this deck? It is so euphoric, especially in a tournament, and I've done it quite a few times, where you Galvanic Iteration and Ancestral Recall, and, you know, Treasure Cruise, whatever, and it just feels so good because you're like, I just spent, you know, 2 cards to get 6 cards. That's pretty awesome. And if you have like Ledger Shredder in play, or like you have Profs or whatever, you're off to the races. Your opponent is dead. Dunzo. They are eliminated from the format. They are ejected. They are the imposter. So that's kind of my reasons for Izzet Phoenix being a top player in the metagame. And I think in the short term and the long term, especially if this deck manages to dodge Treasure Cruise manages to dodge another banning in December, I think like long term this is going to be a great deck, and it's fairly cheap too. You know, all things considered, when like Rakdos Vampires was like $500, $600, $700, $800, and this deck is around, I think, like $200. So definitely a deck that's very cheap. It's worth picking up and playing, and I think it has a lot of, I think it gives you like a lot of positive like reinforcement. It's just fun to play. Also, I would expect a lot of aggro decks to see an uptick in play. I think they were pretty oppressed by Amalia, plus the Vein Ripper decks, just because Vein Ripper is going to outsize a lot of creatures very early on. Of course, Boros Convoke, I think, is going to get a lot better. I think Slickshot Aggro is still a pretty good deck. I think, obviously, with probably more of an emphasis on, targeted removal and things like that. When we expect things like Ledger Shredder to see a lot of play, at least I would expect Ledger Shredder to see a lot of play. Even, if the Izzet Phoenix decks decide to adopt Profs as more of a traditional build than, maybe an off the beaten path type of build, then I think cards like Bitter Triumph, Fatal Push are going to be a lot better for the format. And I think having that cheap interaction for something like Slickshot Aggro is going to be pretty important, because they're just going to be able to put a lot of pressure with Slickshot and kill you. So I would expect that to be, something that players try out, and like we're going to kind of see a fight between something like maybe Gruul Aggro, which is like the Slickshot Aggro decks, and the Boros Convoke decks as well. Of course, as we stated in, when we were talking about Boros Convoke, where one deck is going to lose pretty hard to, Wraths, for more than one reason. I think another deck is going to have, while not ideal to obviously get your board destroyed by a Supreme Verdict. I think when your only threat that you're really, really, hard up on protecting is Slickshot, I think sometimes you're fine with your 2-mana threat that maybe you invested mana in earlier, maybe got a big hit with already, trades with a 4-mana spell, because then you have enough haste things where you're just going to be able to, throw some Swift Spears and things like that on the board, Monstrous Rage them, and your opponent's just magically going to end up at 0 life. So aggro decks I would expect to come out in full force. Of course, control decks and a lot of the other basic archetypes that we would kind of see, I would expect blue-white control to still be a very viable option in the format. I think players just tend to gravitate towards control in some of these more wide-open metagames. And of course, I think for the regional championship, I would expect a decent amount of people to also play control, with that being specifically an open deck list format. So I think overall, we're going to see kind of a renaissance in the Pioneer format. I mean, I think that a lot of the basic archetypes were kind of suppressed by Amalia, the creature combo deck, and then, of course, Rakdos Vampires being the premier mid-range deck. I think that Rakdos mid-range will end up being, a pretty... maybe not like the biggest winner, but it is definitely going to be a winner, because now like that archetype gets to kind of go back to its roots of playing, a more interactive and like finding ways to get card advantage without having to play one-sided show and tell on its deck, and I still expect it to be pretty good. Blue-white control ends up seeing an uptick in play. Greasefang, essentially comes back from the dead. Boros Convoke coming back from the dead, and, being viable options in the format early on. And I think that's going to do it for me in this video. Those are my thoughts, opinions, winners and losers of the Pioneer format. Of course, let me know in the comments down below what you think, what your winners are, what your losers are. If you enjoyed the video, anything like that, I would greatly appreciate any and all feedback. Of course, just getting to interact with the video as well helps in the algorithm, gets people to check out the videos, check out the channel. Of course, subscribe, ring the notification bell if you haven't already. We're so close to 1,000. I definitely want to do some special things by the end of this year for that metric, because I think it's barring anything catastrophic, we're going to end up hitting 1,000. I am so appreciative and thankful for all the people that have shown support, whether you subscribe like today or as of watching this video, or if you've been subscribed for a while. I'm very appreciative. I love all of you. Thank you very much. That's gonna do it for me in this video. Hope you all enjoyed it, and I hope to see you all in the next one.